we're very fortunate to learn more about the book, The Witness of Music, the 80-Year History of Pro Musica Detroit. In this wonderful book, Pro Musica Detroit's president, Alexander Suczek, has laid out in great detail how the area's leading musicians and music lovers organized a local chapter of the prestigious New York-based concert organization, and how it became the only one of 20 chapters to survive the 1929 stock market crash and to thrive for 80 years. At the center of this historical memoir is the story of Mr. Suczek's love for music and his work to keep Pro Musica fiscally afloat and moving forward. For those that know Alex Suczek personally, his story is just about as compelling as the story of Pro Musica. He seems so much younger that it's hard to believe that he was born the same year that Pro Musica's Detroit chapter was founded in 1927. Born in New York City but raised in Grosse Pointe, Alex Suczek spent 38 years as a writer and executive with the Campbell Ewald Agency. While a student at Harvard, he joined the famous Brattle Theater Company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and in some of the plays he arranged and performed music, singing and accompanying himself with a guitar, lute, or Irish harp. Following his college graduation, he served in the U.S. Air Force during the Korean War, took up a serious study of classical guitar, and began his career in advertising and marketing. As a second career, he became a performer of folk and art songs, self-accompanied on his guitar, appearing in concert and on radio and television. In association with leading musicians from the Detroit Symphony, he started a chamber music festival that was held on a number of sites, but many of you remember out here on the lawn, and both managed and performed as a programmer for this organization for 25 years. With a well-deserved reputation as a talented musician and impresario, he became a member of Pro Musica and has now served as its fourth president for 32 years, and I just found out he's stepping down. Of course, as many of you know, he also writes the Grosse Pointe news column, State of the Arts. In 2006, he was decorated by the Austrian government for promoting the country's image in arts and music in America, and his parents were both natives of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Alex is a 40-year member of the Austrian Society of Detroit. Many will remember his mother, Charity, and what I remember most is going into your mother's basement and having my first cold soup, a strawberry soup, and how wonderful it was, but such a talented and wonderful chef and a wonderful person. Alex Suczek's private passions are the study of Shakespeare's life and plays, astronomy and the cosmos, his grandchildren, and windsurfing off the coast of Texas and the Gulf of Mexico, where he winters on South Padre Island. When singing and or playing the guitar, he's often accompanied by his wife Marybelle on an accordion or piano. And speaking of Marybelle Suczek, I hope that no one will mind if I close my introduction on a personal note. I know it's hard to believe that I was once terrified to speak in public, but this was the case until my second year in college. It was then, after I had earned a C in organic chemistry, realized that I wasn't destined to complete pre-med, that I enrolled in the business curriculum at Wayne State, took a public speaking class, and the instructor was none other than Marybelle Suczek. And I can never overestimate how this class really changed my life. Thus, I believe, once again, this is another case of where behind every great man is a great woman. And one other thing that I want to add, if you've ever had the invitation to have dinner at the Suczek's residence on Beaupre, which they just sold, I also found out tonight, you were really in for a treat. The guest list often included the artists that were in town to perform for Pro Musica. As a matter of fact, the first time I dined there in 1980, I find myself a classical music lover, but not big on opera, seated next to American opera diva Jessie Norman, so it was like, oh my God. But on that musical note, I'd like to introduce Alex and have him talk about his book, A Witness of Music, 80 Years of Pro Musica Detroit.
And thank you very much, Mike, and thanks to the Grosse Pointe Historical Society for thinking of having me here. The book and Pro Musica and my life are deeply involved in Grosse Pointe history, and I'd like to think I played a little part in it. I know that there were some grand moments down here on the lawn, Mike referred to the Summer Music Festival, which played a part in Pro Musica too. When we had the Detroit Symphony and the lawn packed with about 1,500 people, and in the middle of the concert, by prearrangement, of course, the moon rose. Things like that have confirmed what I have said all my life, that I really had a lucky star. And all these things contributed to great joy and satisfaction in my life. Pro Musica to a very great extent. However, I must say, Mike, that after that lovely introduction, I could just cut my speech by a third.
No.
It's very interesting how these things come about, how they happen. You know, Mike mentioned the origins, the fact that I was in the Brattle Theater group and made music on stage, and things, little coincidences occurred that in later years I could look back and say, by George, that was already a leading sign toward pro music. In 1948, we were doing a production of Twelfth Night on the Brattle Theater stage, and as I always had supporting roles, nothing big, but I had a walk-on in the play, but I also got together with two other musicians, a cellist and a flutist, and we arranged little Renaissance dances and music to play with, as the opening scene of Twelfth Night, which began, "If music be the fruit of love, play on." And I kind of felt that sometimes that was the motto of my life. It happened that at the time, Paul Hindemith, the great German composer of the mid-20th century, was guest professor of composition in the Harvard Music Department. And the flutist and the cellist were both his pupils. And so, Dr. Hindemith, very charming, delightful, sincere, dedicated man, came to hear the performance by his two pupils, who happened to be accompanied by yours truly playing the Irish harp. Well, the combination of instruments, Irish harp, flute, and cello, was a beautiful combination. The three instruments complement each other wonderfully. And the little music, I took 2 lessons from a harp teacher when I rented the Irish harp from her in Boston. And that was quite sufficient because the music was really quite simple, even though it was lovely, charming music. And so the three of us played. And Hindemith was utterly delighted, and he was in a phase of his composing life where he was very interested in Renaissance music. So he composed a trio for flute, cello, and Irish harp. And we had to go to his class and perform for the rest of the class in his composition. And so I've always been able to say that I'm harpy by appointment to Paul Hindemith. It turns out that Paul Hindemith appeared twice as guest composer, featured artist at Pro Musica. That was actually once before I met him and once afterwards. And with that kind of coincidence, I always felt that my life was kind of intended to become a part of Pro Musica, even though I never knew it at the time. You know, I can go back in that regard to when I was 10 years old, and my parents, my mother played the piano, my father had played the cello, although he was an engineer and mathematician, which is not surprising actually, because music and those skills do go together. And they loved to entertain scientists and engineers and artists. And when I was 10 years old, they heard Ilya Shkolnik, who was then the concertmaster of the Detroit Symphony, perform at a Pro Musica concert. And they talked to him afterwards at the Afterglow, which is a established and still existing tradition at Pro Musica. And they invited him to come over some evening and have dinner. And they had a little party, and then a dinner party. And Ilya Shkolnik came and brought his violin. And after dinner, seated in the living room, he was persuaded to take out his violin, and he played the unaccompanied Bach chaconne. And it was stunning. It was gorgeous. And mind you, in the living room, the sound of this beautiful instrument, beautifully played, just reverberates and fills your soul with music. And you sit there and listen, and at the end of it, as a 10-year-old kid, I was really inspired. It got to me. And I went and got my autograph book, and in my autograph book, he wrote a couple of bars of music from the Bach, and signed his name and his good wishes to me and the date. Years and years later, I happened to come across at the bottom of a drawer this little autograph book, and thumbing through it, I saw Ilya Shkolnik's signature. And at that time, I was already involved in Pro Musica. I thought, my gosh, I've been in Pro Musica since I was 10 years old. And that's the kind of way it went. You know, there were always little things that kind of related and drew me and so on. And the fact that Pro Musica had such a remarkable achievement, which I didn't fully appreciate in the beginning. I just was impressed that the music was always good and the artists always seemed to be wonderful, but I didn't know that much about who the artists were and so on. And so it just was osmosis. And gradually I realized, and I saw Paul Hindemith came to Pro Musica, and Francis Poulenc, and Darius Milhaud, and this was in my time, and I heard these people at Pro Musica. And then Eric Copeland and Paul Creston, getting into a more modern style composer. And I became aware of the challenge with a Hindemith, for example, and with a Creston, that Pro Musica posed for people to learn to appreciate what was newly happening in music, and to develop an understanding and an enjoyment of it. And over the 80 years, from what I had to learn by reading back through all of the archives, and what I experienced myself in almost, well, it's more than 50 years that I've been a member of Pro Musica, I became more and more aware of the progression that came about as Pro Musica went on its way and kept bringing provocative artists, and people would say, oh gee, I can't take that much modern music, you know. And then you heard other people say, well gee, that was interesting, I'd like to hear it again, you know. And then a group forms a gramophone club with people who want to really see if they can't learn to understand what the moderns are doing in music. And they buy recordings of contemporary music, and they gather in their homes and living rooms, and they play these records and listen to them over and over and talk about it. Very interesting experience that Pro Musica's mission provoked in people's lives. Not a huge number of people. I mean, the maximum capacity in those days, when we were in the recital hall in the Detroit Institute of Arts, where we were basically for 75 years. The whole impetus was to have the sense of adventure and curiosity that would enable you to discover and appreciate and understand what the musicians, what the new composers were trying to do. And it represents a very important thread of the history of Pro Musica. You know, I meant to say when I was thanking Mike and the Grosse Pointe Historical Society for thinking of having me talk to you about this, that Pro Musica did play a very big role in Grosse Pointe life, and it has a place in Grosse Pointe's history. There were several decades in which Pro Musica's membership was more than 50% Grosse Pointers. It started out in the city when there was much more residential life in the city. And then it moved to Grosse Pointe, and then it spread over the whole southeastern Michigan region very thinly, because we have always stuck to being a small and intimate organization where you could hear the music in a very small room, and the impact is much stronger, and much more effective, much more moving, because it is small, because you're close to the artist, you can see him, you can sense the effort he's putting into it, you can hear the music better, and you can hear the subtleties in the music when the bow brushes on the strings, or touches the wood in the violin, or when the pedal squeaks on the piano, or you hear one of the musicians breathe heavily because of the effort he's putting into the music. All of this is part of the experience, and it really tells you more about the music. And that's part of what Pro Musica has been all about. I talked a little bit about my childhood experiences. I became a member of Pro Musica first in 1954, although I had already attended a Pro Musica concert when I was home briefly from college. It happened that Francis Poulenc, the French composer, whose opera now, The Dialogues of the Carmelites, is regular repertory at the Metropolitan Opera, about 1948, was doing a concert for Pro Musica with the great French baritone, really more almost a dizer, doing his songs. And that was a great opportunity to go and hear a figure who was already making quite a bit of waves music world. And so I thought that was quite remarkable and very interesting, even though I wasn't sure yet that I liked the music. It fell strangely on the ear, but in time, I learned to, and in time I discovered the charms that it had and the impact, the emotional power that it had, which is one of the things that pro music is all about. I started with Gordon Staples and Paul Leski, the first. Gordon Staples eventually became concertmaster of the Detroit Symphony, and Paul Leski was the principal cellist. And the two of them came to me and said, "Alex, we've got some concerts we do in the summer, and we wonder if we could do them in Grosse Pointe. And we heard you do some of your art songs with the guitar, and as one of our concerts, we'd like to do a violin and cello program, just violin and cello together." And they had some spectacular pieces to do. And they said, "But we thought it would be nice if we could lighten the program by having you do a group of your art songs." Well, I was terribly flattered by two really outstanding professional musicians. So we started the Grosse Pointe Summer Music Festival in 1957. I ran it for 25 years, and then felt the pressure here at the War Memorial that they wanted to try to go for something that would attract bigger audiences and more family style and so on. And I said, "Fine, why don't you step in and do that?" And they did, and there are concerts in the summertime that still are a part of that chain of development. They're no longer the chamber music programs that we had, and it was quite an experience. One of the opening concerts, which we had on the front steps of the Alger House, was at the time when the fish flies were emerging. And what happened was the fish flies happened to have a favorable breeze and came across the lake over the roof of the house, and there they got into the beams of light from the platform where the musicians were playing. And I think that was the concert when Richard Reckline, who was then organist and choirmaster at Christ Church, was playing his harpsichord, and Nathan Gordon was there playing his viola, and Gordon Staples was playing the violin, and Paul Leski was playing the cello, and we had a lovely concert. Except that, in the middle of the first half, all of a sudden, streams, buckets of fish flies were descending on the concert. I remember 2 fish flies landed on the end of Nate Gordon's bow, and as he played his viola, they rode up and down the bow. And Reckline was sweeping fish flies by the handful off his keyboard. And it was an interesting evening, a challenging evening. The following week, our next concert, we enshrouded the stage in mosquito netting, which was unfortunate because the mosquito netting cut the acoustics. But we had a headline in the Detroit News, which was still publishing in that time, that said, "Chamber music in safari setting." Well, not to digress, we're talking about Pro Musica and the book. It was that summer music festival, which turned out to be quite successful, and for which I persuaded the then very active and very influential president of Pro Musica, a lady named Dorothy Coolidge, distantly related to President Coolidge, also distantly related to Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge, who established the Tanglewood, or helped to establish the Tanglewood Music Festival and built the music barn that they had there. Dorothy was Mrs. Music in Detroit, and I invited her to be chairman of the ticket committee for the music festival here. She did it for 2 years, very generously. It was a job she didn't really want. She did it well, and that launched us and made my reputation as an impresario, which was what got Pro Musica's board interested in me. And after I joined in 1954, the board, it only took about 4 or 5 years for the board to elect me to the board, and another 4 or 5 years, or 6 or 7, to elect me first vice president, when a key member had, due to health concerns, had to resign. And I hung on in that position. And finally, Dorothy Coolidge had a health problem and resigned in 1974, announced, "Next year, you won't have me for president," very abruptly. and disappeared from the scene. And the board turned to me, and I never expected this to happen. The board turned to me and said, Alex, you've got to take over. So I did. And it was a learn by the seat of the pants experience. The society had a powerful leader in Dorothy who played all her cards close to her chest, hardly ever confided in me anything. But then neither one of us thought that I was going to take over anytime soon. And when it happened, it was very abrupt because her health condition was very abrupt. And so there I was, president of Pro Musica. The experience involved particularly learning to deal with and look up and motivate the artist managers in New York. And they are a particularly crusty and feisty bunch. And you've got to win their confidence, and you've got to arouse their enthusiasm and their interest. And I learned gradually that that's what I had to do, and proceeded to try to do it. The stories of talking to managements and the stories of going out to find artists that are in the book, and some of the mishaps and some of the great successes and some of the surprises are really quite exciting. I mean, to have talked to a manager and explain to her what Pro Musica is about, to bring composers performing their own music, and to bring young artists who are just as emerging as big names. It's really, in the music business, this is a mission that any impresario would avoid. Because selling new music and composers and selling artists that nobody's ever heard of is the biggest challenge there is in the music business. You know, they want to come and hear the famous stars because they've already been prepped. And they want to come and hear the music of Tchaikovsky and Beethoven and Brahms and Mozart because that's what they know. They're not easy to persuade to come and hear Bartók. In the beginning, when Bartók first came, it was a tough sell. Or Hindemith, or Francis Poulenc, or even Aaron Copland. And so it was a very, very special challenge. Doing that was something that I had to figure out. I didn't have anybody to teach me. But I was very lucky. One manager, a perfectly charming, elegant gentleman by the name of Harry Beale, was the one thing I got from Dorothy. And I called Harry and explained to him my situation, and he had a small but very distinguished roster of artists. And this became a clue, as a matter of fact, a key. You looked for a distinguished manager who had a small but distinguished roster of artists. I think I presented, over a few years, we presented just about every artist that Harry Beale had on his roster. And then we began to spread our wings and make contacts with other managers. And then I explained Pro Musica's mission to a young woman who has been in the business now all these years, no longer a young woman. And she called me one day and she said, Alex, I've got somebody who exactly fits the description. This is a young artist who's brilliant, who is promising, who has high recommendations from outstanding people, and one of these days he's going to be a big name. That was the 17-year-old Joshua Bell. And Pro Musica got him, and we brought him first to Detroit. And there are a lot of artists that we brought first to Detroit who have made names for themselves, like Joshua. Yes, we did present Jesse Norman, which Mike happily remembers. And we presented the Guarneri Quartet. Dorothy booked their contract 2 weeks before they appeared on the cover of Time magazine, and their fee quadrupled. And of course, one of Pro Musica's secrets was how to get the artists just before they become big names and get them at the inexpensive fee. But the artists appreciate that effort. And the Guarneri Quartet, for example, came back to Pro Musica 2 more times at the same original fee. They didn't charge us their fee. And that kind of thing has happened many times. But they appreciate what Pro Musica is trying to do. That's part of the situation, and they don't, well, the contract always comes with the notation, confidential fee, not to be disclosed. A lot of them do it, and they're willing to for an organization like Pro Musica. Who doesn't dream of writing a book? I've heard people say that everybody has at least one book in them. Pro Musica may be my one book, although the family is pushing me to write another one about that famous cook, Suczek, which I may do if I live long enough. But in any case, who doesn't dream of writing a book? And I would say that you want some background and some experience, and you want time to grow into it. 30 years in an advertising agency, oh, actually it was 38 years, as a writer of first ad copy, and then of editorial copy, and then of publications that we produced for marketing activities, was a marvelous schooling. We had a real tough proofreader and copy editor who was like an old school marm with McGuffey's Reader. Does anybody remember McGuffey's Reader? And she really drilled into all the writers on the staff certain principles of clarity and good usage and standard writing standards and so on. They were terribly important. And this was better than any formal education I had. It took me 3 years writing for her before I got a piece of copy back that said, "Alex, I don't see a thing to change." I couldn't believe it. My first piece of copy that I gave to her, she kept for 2 days, and when she came back, every line had red pencil marks on it. Well, anyhow, so much for the training school. At the same time, as you already know, I was having a lifetime of musical activity with kind of a double career, my second career with the guitar and producing musical programs and so on. And that was all terribly important because I couldn't deny music is a part of me, and I feel it very strongly. My years as a member and officer of Pro Musica and my 32 years as president certainly gave me a lot of background and understanding. Pro Musica has a rich oral history, and that was what the board was hoping they would not lose when they asked me to write the book. And it also, I discovered, has a wonderful archival collection, both in the private collections of longtime members and in the Burton Historical Collection at the Public Library. And it was when I got into the Burton Historical Collection that I finally began to grasp the fantastic expanse of Pro Musica's influence and experience and impact in the community. The early years were particularly exciting because it was wholly new at that time. And it's not surprising in a city that was really peopled largely by entrepreneurs who were making things happen in industry and building the auto industry into a mammoth kind of business, that the same kind of entrepreneurial spirit pervaded Pro Musica. And that's a great big part of what made Pro Musica happen the way it did when, after the stock market crash, things declined, and then there was the bank holiday, and people started going bankrupt, and the New York Pro Musica office that provided the composers and artists for all 20 chapters across North America went bankrupt, and all the 19 chapters said, "They go bankrupt, I guess we do too." And in Detroit they said, "This is too much fun, we're going to do it ourselves." And they went ahead and booked artists and composers and so on their own. And they had a great time doing it. Everybody got involved. They asked once at a meeting, how big a committee should we have to select artists and to go out and see composers for Pro Musica? Everybody raised their hand. Everybody wanted to be involved. And it's been that way ever since. So there has been always a passion for music and a readiness to pursue the adventure of exploring new music and a deep commitment to Pro Musica. That was And that became an important part of my life as well. So I began wondering about how I was going to write the book that the board asked me to write, you know, and I thought, concentrate on listing the programs and the unusual music and the composers? Do I make this a musicological exercise and study? A little bit dry and scholarly, but it's worth it because it's really a major achievement what has been done here over the years. And then in looking for a publisher, which is a major challenge for any writer of a book, one of the organizations I approached was Wayne University Press. And initially, when I went to the press and submitted a proposal to the editorial board, they were very enthusiastic, expressed a lot of interest, and the acquisitions editor said to me, I really think they're going to do it. I really think they want to do it. And I said, fine, you know, do they agree with my proposal? Do they have any suggestions? This is part of what an editorial board is supposed to do. And she went back to them, and she got a couple of statements of intent. And the one thing they emphasized the most was, make it a personal story. What people do is what is really interesting, and how people do it is what is really interesting. And the facts will flow in that. And I thought about that, and of course my thought was, I don't want to make this an ego trip. Well, in a way it is, it's unavoidable. But at the same time, that encouragement made me realize that yes, I can tell this as kind of a first-person story, and yes, it will end up being sort of autobiographical. And so if you want to know a little bit about my life and about me, it's in there. And you want to know a lot about Pro Musica, it's in there. And the two weave together very beautifully and naturally. So far, the reactions I've had have been very good. And interestingly, even written that way, the book has been interesting, has caught the interest of the music world. And we've got artists and managers in New York who have called me and said, how do I get your book? Amazon.com, the Pro Musica webpage, a few bookstores actually carry it. And so the book has gotten some circulation. It's in a few libraries, music libraries especially. And thanks to my efforts, it's in the library of the Harvard Club in New York. So I'm very, very proud of that achievement. A lot of people whose names might still be familiar to Grosse Pointers particularly, figure in this history, and they figure in the book. The wonderful lawyer and musician and pianist Ed Froelich, the two attorneys who were key men in supporting and helping the Detroit Symphony, Pete Heffler and Tom Cicero, Margaret Chase, whose son was a trombonist in the symphony, and who herself was a very, very long time prominent piano teacher in Grosse Pointe, and so on, and so on. One name that almost everybody should remember is the official pianist of the Detroit Symphony, Misha Koppler, who was a charter member of Pro Musica and played at many of its special events, played a few of its concerts, and was with us until his death only less than 10 years ago, about 10 years ago. So Pro Musica has been very intimately involved with the community and with people here. The combination of my mission and Pro Musica's, the personal story interwoven with all of the other themes, emphasizes the human involvement of members, managers, artists, and composers. Because when they became involved in what Pro Musica was all about. They would say, yes, what you're doing is really important. It's unusual to get called to come to this kind of a program and activity. And that would mean a great deal to them. And that was part of why we had concessions. I don't think anyone ever offered to come free, although once in the Depression, when Pro Musica was really strapped for funds, an ensemble from the Detroit Symphony, the cellist George Mikel, and concertmaster Ilya Shkolnik, and clarinetist Marius Fossenkemper, all names that old-timers in Detroit in the music business remember very, very well, and some remembered internationally. George Mikel was an internationally famous cellist, and Ilya Shkolnik also was very, very highly respected worldwide as a violinist. And so all of these people contributed to what was going on. And for them, what Pro Musica was doing was an adventure. And it was very interesting to me when, without any prompting on my part, last fall, my friend and acquaintance, Mark Stryker in the Free Press, decided to pay his respects to Pro Musica's 80th year with that incredible article featuring me and the two adventures in my life, which beyond my family, of course, being Pro Musica and my favorite sport, which is windsurfing. And he created a tie, a spirited adventure that motivated me to pursue both. Pro Musica because we were trying to be on the frontier of music, and windsurfing because it's just such a blooming thrill to be out there on the water in the high wind, planing at 30 miles an hour, you know, and say, oh my Lord, am I doing this? And so sometimes in concerts I was sitting there saying, oh my Lord, am I doing this? And other times, I remember a concert where we had a clarinet quartet with Schifrin, the famous clarinetist in New York, who's one of the leading figures in the New York Chamber Music Society at Lincoln Center, playing Brahms' quintet for clarinet and string quartet. There he was. And I was sitting in the back row of the recital hall at the museum, and another member was sitting next to me, and at the end of a movement, she leaned over and said, what do you think of it? And I said, I think I've died and gone to heaven. There were a lot of Pro Musicas. There have been a lot of Pro Musica concerts like that. And experiencing them and helping to bring them about has always been a big thrill. There are a lot of challenges to doing it, of course. And over time, gradually I became aware of more and more of them and tried to pay attention to all of them. Finding and booking a really worthwhile artist and or composer. It's a big challenge. Hosting an elegant afterglow. It's a very important part of the evening because people need to wind down and need to cut loose some of the energy they've accumulated sitting there and listening to the concert. These are things that Pro Musica gradually came to do extremely well. As the afterglow was the idea of some members who said we ought to get together after the concert. We shouldn't just close the door and go home. You know, it's a major, major part of the evening. People talk about the music. People, the new old acquaintances, they enjoy a little bit of refreshment. They talk to the artists and ask them questions. Once we had a piano student from the University Music School who took issue with our concert artist, a pianist, and argued with him volubly, with raised voices, about his interpretation of the music. And it was fun to stand there and listen to it, you know. That kind of thing is very, very special. Providing the right environment for concerts. You need to have a hall that's really good. It has to have nice acoustics. The seats need to be comfortable. There has to be a pleasant appearance. You have to feel good about the place. Everything about it. It's like, well, we just sold a house, you know. We set the stage. Our realtor forced us to remove 1/3 of the furniture, repaint some walls, you know, clean up the kitchen and get rid of all this clutter on the counters. You've got to set the stage. You get rid of the clutter for a concert too. You set things right, and people come in and they say, something important is going to happen. This is special. You get their anticipation going. Terribly important. Surmounting crises. Man, you never know what's going to happen. We had a concert with the very, very modern composer, George Crumb. That was an experience. First of all, the Aeolian chamber players had been on tour. They were going to play his music. Most of it had been commissioned for them, his chamber music, at least. And they arrived from the West Coast. And a trunk containing all of the exotic percussion instruments was following them by Greyhound bus. Well, the Greyhound stopped at too many fire plugs. And the trunk did not arrive. George Crumb came, was our house guest, and I spent the day in the car didn't have a cell phone then, but I made lots of phone calls and I located where most of these instruments were. And one person, the percussionist of the Detroit Symphony, who else, happened to have the most exotic of them all. And one of them was on loan. It was a set of these little miniature Crotoli cymbals. It had been loaned to the orchestra performing a production of Kismet at the Fisher Theater. And he called the music director of Kismet and said, "Joe, I warned you that if something really important came up, I'd have to ask for the Crotoli cymbals back." And he said, "Tonight's the night." So at the concert at 8:30, at 10 minutes after 8, George Crumb got out of my car in front of the stage door of the Fisher Theater, went in, collected the Crotoli cymbals, and we were back on stage at the museum by 8:30 for the concert. That was one cliffhanger of the evening. I can't resist telling you, that this unfortunately is in the book, and I thought I wouldn't tell you things that are in the book, you gotta read it. But giving you the flavor. But I gotta tell you this story because we had, our publicity chairman was trying to get recordings of Crumb's music to play on the radio to get, at that time, we got public service time. And she couldn't find them. They were all stolen from the public library. They were sold out at Harmony House, and there was no way you could get hands on any. And after some research, she finally managed to get a couple. But after some research, what she discovered is that the potheads were using George Crumb's music for turnout parties. It was perfect background music. And that's where all the records were. Well, we publicized the concert, and we didn't have to talk about where the records were. But that night, along with all our black-tie gentlemen and evening-gowned ladies, we had quite a substantial number of young people in sweaters and blue jeans with a faint aroma of cannabis. And Pro Musica rose to the occasion. They stayed for the afterglow and mingled, and we had a great evening. My only problem was we couldn't get them back. We didn't have another, well, until maybe years later, we did another concert that brought in the younger crowd. I don't know whether they were pot smokers, but a lot of sweaters and blue jeans anyway. And it was great because it's really one of the things, one of the missions that it's important for music to accomplish. Anyway, the relationships with managements grew, and we've dealt with the biggest managements in New York. And with each of them, of course, has lots of managers. And sometimes you find one who's sympathetic and understanding, and sometimes you find one who can't be bothered. I wanted to bring back, after we had the marvelous Norwegian pianist, Leif Ove Arsnes, Nami Jarvi brought, of course, Nami loved to bring people from Northern Europe, Scandinavians and the Estonians and Latvians and so on. And Leif, it happened that Leif was being toured as part of a quartet with violin, viola, and cello, and Leif at the piano, commemorating a centennial anniversary of Grieg's life. And it was partly sponsored by the Norwegian government. Very important clue, because it means a low fee. So Pro Musica grabbed it. We didn't know what we were getting at the time. But then it appeared that the Detroit Symphony was presenting Leif later in the season to play the Grieg piano concerto, which probably had been pushed by the Norwegian consulate as well. Anyhow, I called the symphony with whom I already had, and it's very important to network in this business. I called the symphony with whom I already had good contact. And I said, you know, Pro Musica has booked Leif Ove Arsnes with this Norwegian quartet, and you're having him several months later with the Detroit Symphony. I hope there's no objection. They thought about it and said, no, that's okay, that's all right. Because normally, two separate organizations in one city don't have the same artist in the same year. Just, you know, one of those fixations that people have. And Leif came, and it was a lovely concert. It was a wonderful concert. And then I became aware of how famous he was, and then he came back and played with the DSO, and he played the Rachmaninoff Third Piano Concerto at the time that movie Shine had made it so famous. And Nami and Leif went to New York and played the Rock 3 with the New York Philharmonic, with Nami conducting. The night he was in Detroit, I had approached him, I said, Leif, Pro Musica would really like to have you back and play a solo recital. And at this point, Leif was already further along than a lot of the artists we try to bring. And his fee was already out of Pro Musica's sight. Not that that's insurmountable, as you know. But anyhow, he said, look, he said, I would love to play for Pro Musica again, because he understood what we're all about and he appreciated that. He said, but you have to call my manager. And he was with one of the biggest managements in New York, and he was with one of their toughest managers. And I called his manager. Oh, and that night at the concert, after I had made this approach, the management of the symphony said, Alex, would you like to take Leif back to his hotel? I said, sure, I'd love to. So I went backstage afterwards and I said, Leif, I'll take you back to your hotel. And he said, wonderful. And I said, would you like to go out and have something to eat? Because after a concert, most of them are hungry. And he said, sure. And I said, how would you like to go and have some soul food, real Detroit soul food, and hear some jazz musicians come out after their regular gigs and have a jam session? Wow, he said, that would be great. So we piled into the car and drove to Bert's in the marketplace at Eastern Market. Mind you, we got there around 11:30, 11:45 at night. The market was dark with just a few lights burning in the distance, you know. Bert's wasn't very brightly lighted, and there weren't that many cars out in front. And it really looked like kind of an abandoned warehouse district, you know, not exactly the most comfortable atmosphere. But we got out of the car and marched into Bert's, and the owner, there were just a handful of people in there. And the owner came, and mind you, all African American. And the owner came and welcomed us, just delighted to have more people come in, offered us a stage side table. I said, no, put us in the booth, we'd like to be in the corner, we can talk. So we went over and sat in the booth. And Leif, who loves fish, being Norwegian, ordered blackened catfish. Venerable and I were a little more conservative. We had ribs. Anyway, we sat there and talked, and as we talked, there was a trio on the stage playing, and as they played, the door opened and a musician walked in carrying a clarinet, and the guys, while they were playing, greeted him, said, come on up, and he took out his clarinet, sat down on the stage, and just sat down and started playing, you know. And then a little while later, another musician came in. Pretty soon there was a whole ensemble on the stage, jamming out like crazy. And Leif sat there soaking it all in. He'd never had an experience like this. And that was fine. We had a lovely evening. I took him back to the hotel. And I said to him, well, Leif, you know, when you play the Rachmaninoff Third in New York, break a leg. That's the way you wish people. You don't wish good luck. You break a leg. And he said, well, and this is a characteristic expression and an insight into his personality. He said, with Mr. Yarvin's help, I hope to give a fine performance. The thing was that he and Yarvin had a great rapport. You know, to discover these things and to learn these little touches about the musician's personality, is a very special privilege. And actually, when they got to New York and played the Rachmaninoff Third, Leif got rave reviews. And it was the capper on his reputation in the United States. Now he's really unapproachable. But anyhow, I called his manager and I said, you know, I spoke to Leif after a Detroit Symphony concert, and he said that he would love to come back and play a recital for Pro Musica, and he said to call you to set a date. And the manager said, oh, it's impossible. He has absolutely no dates available. Besides which, his fee is now X number of dollars, some enormous astronomical sum. And I said, well, I tell you what, I said, that's quite different from what they've said to me, and I think it would be nice if you asked her. And so he said, very well, I will do that. A week later, the phone rang, and it was this manager, and he said to me, Leif over business wants to play for Pro Musica. I said, that's fine. He said, only the difference is he's going to bring you a trio program. And again, I didn't fully appreciate what the guy was telling me, but the trio was Leif and Christian Tetzlaff, the violinist, who is one of the hottest violinists in the world today, and Christian's sister, who was an outstanding cellist. They were going to play a trio concert of music by Robert Schumann. Well, I couldn't, I mean, there's nothing I could say about I wanted him for a solo recital, you know. I said to say, that's great. Well, the next day I started checking on who Tetzlaff was, and I realized, my God, Pro Musica had made another coup. You know, and that's how it happened. A lot of times it was serendipity. That's part of the story. And if you understand that, then you recognize it faster as you read the story, because to know who all of these people were is a lot to expect. And yet I try to tell it, and it comes through a great deal in the book. But to have an experience like that and garner an artist that I probably would have worked for 2 or 3 years to bring, and Leif brought him like that. Well, the secret was that Leif was going to play his thank you concert for the Gilmore Foundation in Kalamazoo, who had given him a $300,000 grant and a fabulous concert. And Leif bought himself a perfectly gorgeous Düsseldorfer piano, which to play chamber music with that $300,000. I was very grateful. And the idea was, he was playing that concert on a Monday. And the idea was that when he was in Kalamazoo in Michigan, he could squeeze out another day and play a concert for Pro Musica, and that was to be on Tuesday. Well, I already had problem, doing concerts, shifting our concert date from Friday, which it had been since time immemorial, to a Wednesday because the schedule at the museum was very difficult. And then to have a concert on Tuesday, but with a package like that, I couldn't lose. So, I'm going to tell you, a part of this story illustrates an issue that was very important in the life of Pro Musica, and that was what I was talking about, creating the right environment and the right mood for the artists. You have to cultivate the artists. You have to make them feel loved and appreciated. They've got to feel good, so that when they walk out on that stage, they're primed to give you a brilliant performance. And if you don't do that, you may not get it. Really serious. So, the plan was we were going to drive to Kalamazoo on Monday and hear Leif's thank you concert with Christian and Tanya. And not exactly the same program that they were going to do for Pro Musica. And Leif did play some solo music in that concert. And then on Tuesday, we were going to bring them back to Detroit, and they were going to stay as our house guests, and they were going to play the concert. And on Wednesday morning, they were hopping a plane to fly to the West Coast where they had another concert, It's some life. And when we got to Kalamazoo Monday evening, we found the auditorium. It was in a school, a very nice school, and a lovely auditorium, but too big for chamber music, not good acoustics, and only half full. So there was no intensity to the atmosphere. And Leif and Tanya and Christian came out on stage, and they played what was a perfectly nice, technically okay concert, but it never caught fire. The audience was polite and applauded nicely, but there was never any flame of enthusiasm. And when I went backstage afterwards, the three of them were standing there looking sort of a little bit off, not grinning from ear to ear, not bubbling with enthusiasm. And they said, well, what did you think of it? I said, it was a nice concert. Oh, yes, but it wasn't any good. Wasn't any good. And Leif said, and they brought that piano especially from New York, and I didn't like it. What do you do? It's terrible. And I thought to myself, oh dear, what is the problem here? Is it the hall? Is it the audience? Is it the way they've been treated? Is it just an off night? Or is the combination of musicians not a good combination? Are they not turning each other on? So next morning, we got out of our hotel breakfast and got in the car and loaded up instruments and started for Detroit. And all I could think of was, what am I going to do? Well, how's this going to be tonight? Have I made a mistake? And we got home to Grosse Pointe, and we had planned that we would have a late afternoon dinner and then let them take a little rest, and then they would play the concert, and they wouldn't eat again until after the concert. And so we served fish, because it's Leif's favorite food. We had a beautiful salmon fillet, as a matter of fact. And Tanya and Christian actually, which surprised me, had a little glass of wine with it, on the same day as the concert. Didn't bother them one bit, but Leif didn't. was a little bit more restrained. But in any case, that night we got into the hall. It was just time for Leif to go out on stage and try the piano, which our friend Tom Pettit, who's been around forever and used to be the official piano technician for the symphony, had gone over and worked over and got it all in tip-top working order and perfectly tuned. And Leif came out, tried the piano, and was very pleased with it. Good sign, beginning. And then the Pro Musica audience poured in, and with the talent that we had on stage, the place was full. And they were all there. And Pro Musica is an audience where everybody knows everybody. And there are always lots of yakety-yakety-yak before the concert. But when the musicians walk out on the stage, total silence and anticipation. And you could even feel the energy in this anticipation. And the three of them took a bow to an enthusiastic greeting of applause, sat down at the piano, and started to play. I have to tell you, with the first 3 notes of the music, I had shivers running up and down my spine because the performance was absolutely inspired. I've never heard a better chamber music performance in my life. It was one of those special treats that you just think you live for. We have those experiences from time to time with Pro Musica. I mean, the concerts are almost invariably good, but sometimes they're simply unbelievably good. And this was one. And the whole secret, I felt, was in the prep. You know, greeting them, bringing them home, serving them a nice dinner, making them feel comfortable, telling them, now go on upstairs and take a nap. You've got a concert to play after the meal. They did that, and they liked it. And the climax was the little thank you note that Christian Tetzlaff wrote in our guest book, which said, nice hall, great audience, wonderful food, and thanks for the sleepover. It was really a delightful, it's that kind of experience that has made, for me, Pro Musica a very special treat. And I think for the members of Pro Musica who've stuck with it, I mean, we've had people who've been members for 40 and 50 years, and they won't quit, they won't leave. It's totally a special experience. You know, I talked a little bit in the beginning about the marketing of the book in New York. We had a press conference and book sale and signing in New York. That was quite successful. That was very nicely attended and got a lot of very pleasant attention. Who really cares about a book like this? Well, first of all, I think you can, because there's a lot of Grosse Pointe in it, and there are names of people that you will remember, and there are associations that mean something to the local people. It was that audience that the Wayne University Press Board thought was the only audience we had, which suggested to them that they might not sell enough copies to make money on a book, and so they ultimately turned me down, and I had to go find another publisher. I was very lucky. I found a wonderful publisher, and the book was legitimately published. It's not Vanity Press, and they did a lovely job on the book. I mean, the publisher picked this cover, which is of a piano waiting on the stage at Orchestra Hall. It never occurred to me that that would make a cover for the book, but it exactly says what we're talking about. It's the witness of music, the stage and the piano waiting for the artist and waiting for the audience. And she had the right inspiration when she said, that's the cover. And that cover came out of the archives of the Detroit Symphony, which they were delighted to provide. But who else cares about a book like this? The artists do. I had any